Record. All right, so welcome again, everyone, to Ujima Wednesday. This month, we're studying racial capitalism in urban histories. And tonight, we're honored to have Professor Destin Jenkins. Destin is a scholar of racial inequality in America. He is interested in the financial processes and relationships that foster racial inequality and their implications for democracy, public space, and social movements. Jenkins is the author of The Bonds of Inequality, Debt and the Making of the American City, and co-editor of Histories of Racial Capitalism. Prior to joining the faculty at Stanford University, he was a Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of History at the University of Chicago. He has held fellowships at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University and the Robert L. Heilbroner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Destin Jenkins. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Jock. And to all of you here, I'm not sure where you're at, probably in Boston. I think the sun is maybe still out. Really appreciate you guys spending time with me this evening and inviting me to talk. Really, what I kind of want to do today is first hand you all your flowers. This organization has been described by a colleague at Chris Dessin at Harvard Law School as, a truly visionary organization aiming to remake the economy through democratic processes and at a grassroots level. So I just want to give you all a shout out and really impressive work that you do. And also the kind of political and financial education. I got a chance to take a look at the website, and obviously this conversation here is a part of that commitment. But really impressive list of topics, and political education and financial education without sort of gearing toward financial literacy is an important distinction, I think. And it sounds like you guys are really committed to that week in and week out. So I just want to give you all your flowers, if you will. I guess I have less of a presentation and more of a few set of provocations, a set of thoughts about what racial capitalism is, and I think perhaps more important than what it is, why it matters, why it's an important starting point for social movement organizing, for questions of solidarity, for ways of seeing as a methodology, perhaps, for approaching matters of, municipal budgets and otherwise. So that's what I'm hoping to do. But I know that our time is short today. So what I'd like to just do is kind of give you a sense of how I came to racial capitalism, why I think it's important. And then hopefully you guys can, we can have a dialogue and maybe you all can educate me on what's happening in Boston. I spent a year, I lived in Austin, and I actually really did enjoy my time in Boston. And that may be a surprise because I'm from New York originally. So, I had to kind of, there's some folks who had a lot to say, but the way I got out of tensions and conflicts was I said, listen, I'm a Met fan, but I don't know if that made it worse given the World Series history. But anyway, I digress. Really, really good to be here. And Paige asked where I'm from. I'm from Queens, New York. So yeah. So let me say a little bit about how I came to racial capitalism, and then I'll get into the specifics of what it is, why it matters, what the stakes, et cetera. So I was a college student, giving away my age, but I was a college student in 2008. I went to Columbia University, and I remember vividly the financial crisis, as many folks do. And one of the big lessons about for me, the financial crisis was, the institutions you've never heard of, the individuals you've never met can dramatically and radically alter your day to day. I had gone to great schools and received great education, but knew very little about, bailouts and yields and bond prices and so forth. Basically the financial processes, mortgage-backed securities. I had no idea what that was. But very quickly I saw what the consequences were. I mean, whether it be, foreclosures in my neighborhood, folks unemployed. Just the devastating fallout of the financial crisis really brought my attention to the importance of mortgage finance, bond finance, and so forth. And so, but I was also, that happened, right? The story of Black wealth eroded in so many parts of the country, also occurred at the same time, if you all remember, it seems like a long time ago, financial crisis, 2008, happened at the same time that we were told we were in a post-racial America, the election of the first Black president, Barack Obama. So for me, it was trying to square, on the one hand, the narrative that we were in a post-racial America, and on the other hand, the subprime crisis and the ways in which it was predicated on racialized economic predation. So how do I make sense of the subprime crisis, the fallout of the economic crisis, and the stories of us being in a post-racial America? And also trying to, again, make sense of these institutions, Moody's, investment banks, credit rating analysts, so many actors who I had no idea about, who, for all intents and purposes, were very far removed from my day-to-day reality, but who could, again, dramatically shape the everyday environment. And so it was in that context of trying to square those narratives, of trying to think about the material processes that seemed racialized, even though we were told that race had nothing to do with the economy, with politics in this post-racial age, that brought me to racial capitalism as a framework, as a way of making sense of, again, racial differentiation and questions of accumulation. And I can talk to folks, and we could spend some time thinking about, the reading list, the key thinkers. Of course, people like Cedric Robinson, whose classic book, Black Marxism, is published in 1983. Robinson is on sabbatical in the UK. He's drawing on conversations with South African anti-apartheid activists who in the late 70s begin to think about this idea of racial capitalism to make sense of the kind of crushing, suffocating racial regime in South Africa, as well as the kind of profiteering that helped keep that regime afloat. So, it's in that context, in which Robinson, as the historian Robin Kelly nicely summarizes, it's in that context whereby Robinson develops the idea of racial capitalism into really a theory of how arguably the modern world came to be, the relationship between questions of feudalism and capitalism, the fundamental relationship between racial differentiation and questions of accumulation. So Cedric Robinson was a key thinker for me at that time, as was Du Bois, as was so many other folks. And so it's in that milieu that I came to racial capitalism, again, to try to make sense of the world around me. So what is it? Now, can I ask just a kind of, how many folks have heard about racial capitalism, have heard of the term? Because I ask because it's really quite interesting. When I used to teach on this subject, folks hadn't heard about it, right? A lot of folks hadn't. And nowadays, when I ask, it kind of becomes like this, either an empty signifier or a free floating signifier. It's on the tongues of many folks. But when, we get into a dialogue, sometimes folks have a very different definition and understanding of what it means, to say nothing of the very different kind of stakes that people sort of highlight when they talk about racial capitalism. So if I may, just to get a sense, how many folks have heard of racial capitalism? And okay, all right, cool. And the instructor in me has to ask, does anybody want to throw out a sense of why the concept matters to you, or why you think it's an important concept to engage? Nia, I see your hand. Would you mind jumping in?
I don't mind jumping in. I'm the ED of Ujima, so I try to stay out of
right. Okay. Respect.
the conversation. So you caught me as I was eating and
okay.
But why is racial capitalism important to me? This is the question.
Yeah.
Destin? Yeah. I think there's some resonances in what you've talked about in terms of understanding events, understanding the world around you. I would say for me, very specifically, then understanding the U.S. and having a racialized experience of the U.S. as a Black woman, it being important as an avenue, I guess I would say, to more fully comprehend the U.S. experience.
And David, I saw a hand. Did you want to jump in? You're on mute.
No, I was raising my hand because I'd heard that term, so
Okay.
I was responding that way.
I got you. Yeah. So so let me maybe say a little bit, just kind of what Nia has said is, as an avenue, as a way of seeing, as a methodology, as an approach. I want to come back to that in just a little bit. And I also want to say, like, just as a preview, there are some limits, like there are limits for any framework, or any framework. And this, to my mind, I'm less interested in seeing this as like a all-encompassing, totalizing theory of the world as it developed and as it exists in the present, and more about seeing racial capitalism as a method, as a way of seeing and bringing certain issues, themes, topics into the fore, and also kind of thinking about connections in ways otherwise obscured. So okay, what is racial capitalism? Just a kind of basic working definition. To me, when I think about that question, what is racial capitalism? To me, I think about it, it's a contention. It's a declaration about the interdependent relationship between race and capitalism. Okay, so let me kind of parse racial capitalism. So for me, I think about race broadly conceived, not just race as racial identity, but race as the kind of umbrella under which you might fit relations of racial inequality, racism, racial hierarchy, and race as a doctrine or ideology, or a way of, structuring social relations based off of, for instance, the idea that, people have separate blood, right? Or that the world could be divided among distinct groups, with some people having so-called Black blood, other folks having Aryan blood, et cetera, right? So race to me is broadly conceived in this definition of racial capitalism. And so seeing race as the umbrella under which fits inequality, racism, hierarchy, and ideology. And capitalism, I mean, this is a betraying of kind of my Marxist roots. And I think there's an interesting story to be told there of the kind of roots and routes people take to land on and come to racial capitalism. For me, I see capitalism as, of course, a very contentious, unstable, contingent process that unfolded over time. But the definition I work through is the kind of search for surplus value. So really, to think about what is racial capitalism, it's a declaration about the interdependent relationship between race and capitalism in the ways I've described and defined, although people have their own definitions that they work with as they employ racial capitalism as a framework. And as a contention, I mean, and I'm drawing on the work of a friend and colleague, Peter James Hudson at UCLA, it's that in actual historical fact, capital did not accumulate. Relations of credit and debt were not extended, and monetary knowledge was not amassed without race. And that race was and remains decisively shaped by accumulation, questions of profit, and also capital loss and destruction. So really what we're talking about is a kind of question, as my colleague and a fellow, I guess, he's not my fellow, but for you guys, Walter Johnson, who teaches at Harvard, the difference between science fiction, tales of science fiction about how capitalism developed in a sort of theoretical sense versus how it developed in actual historical fact. And seeing, for instance, the examples of life insurance offered on slave voyages, land dispossession through mortgage foreclosure or through Indian removal, of course, the making of King Cotton. Or you can think about reparations paid to former slaveholders, later invested in other forms of unfree labor in parts of South America, as ways of thinking about how capital accumulates and how that's predicated on relations of racial inequality. And despite, or perhaps because of, major ruptures, breaks, the Civil War, or the so-called end of formal slavery, that becomes a crucial moment through the kind of compensation packages offered, for instance, for a way to reproduce racial capitalism through the kinds of investments that again occur along racialized lines or racial lines. So that's the kind of what of racial capitalism. I mean, you know, there's a definition there, but I also think it's an insistence, right? It's also important as a kind of corrective to a historical interpretation about the origins of capitalism and perhaps the modern world, which would say that the history of capitalism is the outgrowth of supply and demand, or moments of equilibrium and disequilibrium, or even folks who would emphasize state power and other large-scale institutional processes, but to see that as highly deracialized and to see race as, you know, some externality or having nothing to do with the fundamental story, according to these accounts of, you know, say class, conflict, or otherwise. So as a point of departure, as a corrective, and as a way of sort of assessing and sizing up, and perhaps even stitching together processes of the slave trade, chattel slavery, and indigenous dispossession as crucial moments in the history of racial capitalism, and then thinking about the afterlife, the reverberations, and the echoes into the present. I think it also is a method, a way of seeing, and you know, since I know I was reading the website, Ujima's described it. You guys describe yourself as an investment vehicle for raising capital for real estate, businesses, small businesses, and infrastructural projects. Maybe you might appreciate the point about infrastructure here. I mean, we could think about, for instance, my work looks at municipal bond finance. That is the ways in which cities, states, localities raise funds by turning to the bond market, effectively issuing a loan, borrowing from all kinds of investors, and financing large-scale capital improvement projects, streets, parks, schools, you name it, through this particular market. And when you approach those sources, right, or you approach the financial press that writes about these deals, these bond deals, or the basic financing of infrastructure, there's a way in which all of that gets laundered of the specific connections to a place and laundered of the kind of racial dynamics that may, for instance, shape or be foundational to a secure investment. And so we can think about, right, what does racial capitalism as a framework do for the very concept of risk, right? We could think about the ways in which places, cities, American cities are written about and as being somehow more riskier than others, without any conversation or explicit reference to, you know, Black folks or brown folks, or arguably the very people who live there, right? People become abstractions, right? A mere demographic category. And that somehow makes up or informs the notion of whether a place is risky or a safe investment. But we could think about how a racialized notion of risk has led to the underfunded infrastructure in our communities. We could think about, for instance, how risk gets coded as deracialized, or emerges as a problem or a concern when we only think about the efforts of Black folks demanding, you know, protesting in the streets, right? Then a place may become risky when the activities of Black folks or brown folks threaten to disrupt municipal spending priorities, for instance. But other kinds of activities, i.e., you know, white domestic terrorism, never really emerged to the category of a risk. And there's a way, again, in which matters of infrastructure, bond finance, gets kind of laundered of its racialized terms, implications, and racial capitalism as a framework is the corrective. It's the way of seeing to insist that actually there's the matter of the very basic matter of infrastructural investment, of buying and selling bonds and debt is always shaped by relations of racial inequality and racial ideology. So that's just an example. Again, happy to say more about the infrastructure piece, but that's just an example of why racial capitalism, of why it is an important framework for, again, approaching matters that otherwise seem like they have nothing to do with race. I'm sure many folks know about the redlining stuff in the US housing market. That is, of course, perhaps the clearest example, the clearest 20th century example of the relationship between race, capital, and credit. There are many such other examples, and racial capitalism as a framework helps us see those things. And I think the last thing I'll just say is I think racial capitalism is important as the basis for organizing. For starters, how do we name the system, right? Anyone who is engaged in movement building work, anyone who is engaged in trying to base build, trying to neutralize your opposition through kind of, public education campaigns and so forth, you have to name the system, you have to name the problem. And so then one question becomes is when people talk about capitalism as a problem, what do they have in mind? What version of capitalism do they have in mind? Because how you define the problem or how you understand the problem obviously shapes the kinds of tactics, strategies you might employ. And so for a starting point, I mean, it's important to think about what is the system? What do you name it? What are its contours? And I think racial capitalism is an important way of describing the social and economic and political relations that continue to generate inequities, even as it also creates certain spaces and niches for a well-to-do racialized other, if you will. And I also think that racial capitalism is important for thinking beyond the United States. The work of my colleague, Alan Lumba, who teaches at Virginia Tech, has traced the development of racialized monetary knowledge in the colonial Philippines and how that effort coincided with a similar process in the Caribbean, often by the same actors. So here, when we start to think about, yes, organizing is local. We should think about organizing at the local level, local scale. But as we think about questions of solidarity, what is the basis of solidarity? What is the theory of solidarity? What are the shared terms and experiences? What are the kind of historical lineages or past on which we draw to make sense and ground ourselves in the present? And I think racial capitalism is an important framework, again, for reasons of naming the system, but also for what it allows for when we think about organizing beyond the United States, even as we recognize, of course, the importance of local struggles. So that's a lot, perhaps rushed. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm just trying to think about the time that we have together, but hopefully enough there to think about the what, the why, and happy to think about how more precisely it relates to the work that you do, as you guys then help me think about what it is you guys are doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Destin. We do have until 7:15 together. So I wonder if now is a good time to just maybe pause and see if there are any questions or reactions from the group.
Yeah, I think, Destin, thank you for all of that. It definitely made me, and I'm sure others, think about this in a different way. And I guess I'm just wondering, as we've talked about infrastructure specifically, and as we talked about municipal financing and just financing in general, and the amount of capital that there is in the system that still doesn't make its way into Black and Brown communities. I mean, how does that happen without the construct of capitalism? I mean, there are so many biases that are already in the institutional investor landscape. Where does that bottleneck, or how does that bottleneck get removed so that capital can flow freely to some of these communities?
Yeah, Jack, a great question. Now we get into the nitty-gritty of politics here. So interestingly enough, just as some context, since I published my first book, I've gotten a chance to really talk to people in the financial world, many of whom were stirred and motivated to do something like so many folks in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And these are folks within the financial crowd who have recognized the inequities of the financial system and who make the argument, more or less, that the problem is one of the lack of capital investment in various communities. And so from that starting point, right? And so really what we're talking about, our starting points, is the idea that the problem is not capitalism per se, but the problem is that wealth has been hoarded along, by white folks or by select institutions. And if we only unfree the bottlenecks, the roadblocks, and allow capital to do what it does, and to do so through an equitable lens, then our various inequities will be remedied. And some would go even further to say that, racism is a yoke on the economy, right? And that upon releasing or loosening, if you will, that yoke, you can actually have more expansive economic growth. And so for various folks, again, racism is a problem because it inhibits. Whereas you have other folks who say that actually, again, and this is kind of consistent with the racial capitalism framework, is that actually racism is not the bug, if you will, within the system, right? Is that it's constitutive of, it's from the very beginning. And now, you raise this question, can one be an anti-racist without being an anti-capitalist if race and capitalism are intertwined? Right? These are the debates, the implications that flow from the framework, and they matter in terms of the kinds of solutions being proposed. And to your point, Jock, again, going back to folks within the financial crowd who, again, motivated, moved by the need to do something, have gravitated to what's described and known as ESG investing. It's a framework, environmental, maybe folks are familiar with it, environmental, social, and governance investing. It screens out the kind of bad actors of those institutions, actors, perhaps even industries that undermine environmental standards as defined by some international body, that undermine social relations and that contribute to corruption. It screens those out and tries to sort of say and mobilize investors to invest in the kind of the right thing. And so many of those folks are using ESG as a lens to do just what you said, right? To kind of remove the bottlenecks, the obstructions, the roadblocks. But it still goes back to the kind of philosophical question about like, okay, and this wouldn't be the first time. I mean, this is the argument made about enterprise zones in the 1980s, right? The idea that these are places underfunded, divested from, and if only through tax breaks, through subsidies, through abatements, you can then direct capital into these divested spaces and then unlock the city. We know the actual history of that is the kind of history of those breaks. That thesis has led to gentrification, for instance, soaring real estate values in places formerly divested from. And so anyway, I guess what I just want to kind of offer here is to bring attention to the philosophical debate about the fundamental problem. Is it the bug or is it constitutive of the system? And to kind of historicize a little bit the question that you raised, Jock, about roadblocks, and to be cautious of the kinds of solutions proposed, offered, and deployed in the 1980s, which again saw the problem as roadblocks. If we can offer some tax abatements and so forth, all will be well. And then to think about that as crucial to the story of gentrification. There's a lot more to say about infrastructure finance, which again I'm happy to say more, especially as it relates to questions of climate change. But maybe I'm talking too much.
So one in the chat here from Paige. Paige, did you want to ask it or?
Yeah, thank you, Jock. Yeah, Destin, I asked about ESG investing and if we should be skeptical of that. It kind of feels like it's just greenwashing by a different name or by a different context.
Yeah, I think it's someone say it's the lipstick on the pig, the latest version of consciousness capitalism. I mean, I think yes, one could be skeptical, but what I would just say here's what I'll say is we don't have much time before, and indeed the effects of climate change are already apparent, okay? So the question then becomes, what is the means by which you raise significant funds and capital to provide the physical infrastructure for communities who are already vulnerable to things like rising sea levels? Okay, if we think about it and recognize, hold also in the left hand or the right hand, probably more appropriately, the limits of reform through Congress, for instance, given the composition, given the composition of the Supreme Court. If we think about those as highly as obstructions to the kind of progressive vision that we wish to see, and as bulwarks against using federal financial power to provide resources to communities, then what else beyond the bond market is the way of raising funds to create, to finance infrastructure that communities of color, working class communities in the United States and elsewhere need? What is that other way? And ESG investing, for all its limits, to my mind, the best argument is that it is a lens to kind of equitably finance infrastructure, given the existential dilemmas that are before us right now. Okay, so I am in general skeptical of ESG because, I've talked to many folks who are trying to push the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, push various corporate firms to think more expansively about risk, to think about the racialized terms of social investment and the G in the ESG, and finding a great deal of pushback. So in general, I'm hesitant to thinking that that is a lever on which to pull. But on the environmental climate change piece, given the pace at which Congress moves and how difficult it is even to get Build Back Better off the ground, I'm a little hesitant that if not through federal financial power, then the bond market, or is there some other third possibility, some other third way? And I think that third way is important. And so really what you're also hearing is me kind of having a somewhat limited political imagination, being unable to think about that third way, raising capital at scale for infrastructure projects that require repeated maintenance over a 25, 30, 40-year period. And when we need it now, maybe not now, yesterday. So that's a long answer to say, yes, I'm skeptical of ESG investing, but specifically as it relates to ecological destruction and the environmental crisis before us, I think it's worth sitting with and at least sitting with and thinking about the possibilities.
Amazing, thank you. And I think Louise had a question. Louise?
Well, you're talking about the 80s. There was a book called American Poison by Eduardo Porter, and he said that how the tax cuts and all that was racist. A lot of talking about, how they were saying, I think racist capitalism, they're using race to discourage people from giving it to the public goods. They're promoting racism. And that's what I kind of think that racist capitalism is a lot. Is that like in the 60s, when the civil rights came by, you started having more investment in public goods. I'm glad I came of age at them. They subsidized UMass Boston 90%. You could put yourself through college on the minimum wage. But in the 80s, they took all away that, saying to people like the blacks got everything. The blacks are going to get this. And, I mean, they kind of use that. But they talk about sea levels affecting the vulnerable poor people. At first, I wasn't with FEMA when it came out, because the places that would be saved from raising sea levels were Situate. Some of those important. And they spent they rebuilt their houses. Those people got insurance. Well, they say, New Orleans, the richer people got the help with the rising sea levels. And like Situate, I didn't get sympathetic till it came to Revere when they had poor people there. But it's But for the environmental thing, they're saying, oh, we have to do the environmental thing that will help the blacks too. But they're not talking about how much it's helping the rich whites too. You know, and if they say it happens, why not look why the blacks suffer more? I mean, I think it's racial capitalism sort of using the blacks. Either the blacks are against or say, oh, like forgive college loans. I think that should be on income, you know, because they say the blacks suffer more. Well, like maybe the blacks suffer more. You should not forgive all college loans if you're responsible. But why not say the blacks may do it because of discrimination on jobs? They didn't get the time. They don't have the family wealth and all that kind of thing. And I think capitalism is a selfish thing. It's supposed to be everybody's self-interest is supposed to cancel out. I think that was the original theory. But it didn't work that well. Socialist theory didn't work, and the capitalist theory didn't work like it was supposed. Everybody's interest was supposed to cancel out, so everybody was satisfied, but it didn't work.
I mean, that was a great summary of, you know, it was excellent. Thank you, Louise, for sharing that from, you know, the racial differentiation to, you know, I heard a little bit about the racial welfare state, even through the expansion and the kind of New Deal along racialized lines, to the rejection of the public after, not coincidentally, but after the expansion of the public and opportunities for Black and brown folks, and especially Black women in particular, through affirmative action programs in municipal departments, municipal agencies. So the rejection of the public welfare, once it was seen as a sort of racialized process, a racialized construct, even though it was already racialized to begin with. So that was really just an excellent summary. Thank you, Louise.
Hi, Destin. I would love if you wouldn't mind actually talking a little more about infrastructure finance.
Sure, Nia. Where do you want me to go with this? Because I could kind of nerd out. So
nerd out. We have until 7:15, so nerd out.
Yeah. Would it be helpful to kind of give a sense of how it works, or what in particular? Yeah. So yeah, and this is folks who are interested in the like nitty gritty could pick up my book, The Bonds of Inequality, Debt and the Making of the American City. That project as a starting point tries to think about a sleepy industry, the municipal bond market, and tries to put it at the center of debates and discussions around the persistence of inequality in America. When we usually approach this discussion of inequality, we may talk about the housing market, for instance. We may talk about the kind of processes of financialization, the changing shape and scope of the corporation. And so for me, what I wanted to do with the book was to say, like, okay, how do municipalities in the United States generate fund infrastructure? And what are the kind of racialized terms through which that infrastructure is funded, and how does it kind of create and exacerbate racial inequality in the built environment? So that's the project. I mean, the big kind of motivation, just as, kind of background, kind of ABCs, if you will. If you think about massive infrastructure projects, capital improvement projects, the most times, the sort of most familiar you might be with these questions of bond finance might be like a bond referendum. Yes on this issue, no on this issue, kind of flattening of the complexity of the financing at work. And so what you'll have is, take the city of Boston, or maybe the Boston Redevelopment Agency, or some other political entity endowed with the power to borrow, even if they have to rely on different revenue sources to pay back bondholders. They turn to the bond market, borrow X amount of dollars to finance some infrastructure projects. some infrastructure project, and with the pledge that they'll pay the bondholder, the note holder, the debt holder, tax exempt interest income from some source. Maybe it's property taxes. If it's bonds financing toll rolls, it might be toll revenues. It could be some other kind of source, revenue source earmarked that then goes upward, usually to wealthy individuals who can, again, kind of afford to forego their capital for 20 years, collect tax exempt interest income, usually semi-annually. And there you also have institutional investors as well. So that is a kind of the kind of basic social relations between borrowers and lenders. Involved in that transaction are your credit rating analysts, your Moody's, who evaluate the credit profile or reputation of a borrower. And what's really interesting, just as a side note, an important one though, is if you think about a Moody's, for instance, usually they'll tell themselves that it's kind of based off of the objective assessment of matters of revenues, expenditures, long-term debt profiles, the ways in which a city is governed, et cetera. But you could think about, when credit rating analysts are summoned really before Congress in the late 60s and pushed as to how a AAA rating is even determined. Oftentimes what you get is the very clear confession that it's based off of political opinions, subjective ones at that. And so one question becomes, what is the criteria on which they draw to, again, rate a city one way or the other? And oftentimes it's old information, outdated information about a city, for instance, that actually doesn't exist, no longer exists because of the different economic profile. Or we're talking about in the late 60s, how the urban uprisings, whether it be in Watts or Detroit, San Francisco, Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, then gets folded into the credit evaluations of these rating analysts and how that shapes the cost to borrow for those municipalities, kind of perhaps deepening the crisis that the structural crisis oftentimes generated or certainly exacerbated by US housing policy after World War II. So really the deepening of a crisis through these seemingly objective credit evaluations. So if you have your borrowers and your lenders, you also have your credit rating analysts who play a major role as well. And in addition to just kind of that basic political story really between borrowers and lenders and the dollars and cents of the matter, you have the ethical and moral question. Which projects are worthy of debt? Which communities are worthy of debt? Which is to say, we see, for instance, in the late 1980s, the 1980s really throughout, how city officials will go to the credit rating analysts and say, hey, next year we're expected to have the Democratic National Convention here in our city. Or, hey, we've got a new stadium. Or, hey, we have some other kind of shiny project that in the hopes of increasing or improving the bond rating. And so what you see is over time, certain kinds of projects, infrastructure projects are valued. That changes over time, depending on how it can allow a city to hit revenue targets. But you also have the ethical question of which communities are unworthy of investment, which communities are worthy of investment. And again, just as to maybe use an example, we could think about a place like San Francisco. Mayor Willie Brown, the first Black mayor in San Francisco in the late 1990s, one of the major kind of financial organ or news organ for the bond business, basically makes a point that actually having Willie Brown, a Black mayor, is not a problem. Not a problem on its own. The question is, will he be able to check and hold the line on social spending? So there is an example, certain kinds of projects worthy of investment, but not other projects that may be beneficial to the well-being and general life chances of community residents. So that's a long way of saying there's the dollars and cents, there's a political story, but then there's the ethical and moral story of who's worthy of investment, who is not. And the book tries to bring that all together. But it's something, that's the stuff you don't see when you're just presented with, yes, this bond issue, no, that bond issue. if you're even asked at all.
Thank you, Destin. And can I ask a quick follow-up? I guess I'm curious. So we talked about ESG investing. I'm actually curious, as far as you know, are there any kind of sea changes that you've noticed when it comes to infrastructure finance? I guess I'm just kind of wondering movements that we've seen in other sectors. So impact investing, philanthropy, other social movements. Do we see any of these conversations crossing over into this conversation? Do we see them being influenced at all?
You mean like in terms of just the kind of alternatives beyond the
Yes, exactly. So even this notion of what's worthy of investing, for example, or what's worthy of investment, I'm curious as to whether actors in this
Yeah.
round are
Yeah, actually, no, a really good question. I can highlight kind of two examples. One actually, a scholar, Lourdes Herman, who has a history of in the financial industry. She is leading the Public Finance Initiative, I believe it's called. She's currently lecturing at Harvard, actually. And so her, as I understand, the project is working with city officials, municipal officials, to rethink matters of disclosure, to rethink, to kind of use an equity lens to think about borrowing on for whom or for what purposes. And so I believe she's engaged in, and her colleagues and team are engaged, partnered with major stakeholders in rethinking and pushing local officials to use equity as the guide for infrastructural investments. So that's one effort. I mean, from what I understand, it's very much a focus on the issuers. When, and I haven't heard all that much about the bondholder stuff and the financial sector in general, and the question of why it is we're dependent on the financial market to begin with for our most essential services. I mean, part of it, I suppose you could say it's because of, the delays and inequities produced through federal funding. That's one answer. It's probably not the, and one could say that, well, perhaps it's more efficient, though I would say efficiency is often used as a kind of ideological argument to guard against other solutions, right? Somehow more efficient than other mechanisms. So that's one example. And thank you for posting the link in the chat. And then the other example is actually a group called Activest. ACTIVEST. And part of their project is trying to engage bondholders, right? Bondholder engagement to make arguments around, which communities to invest in, to put, part of it is through a kind of ESG lens, I believe, to invest in communities along equitable lines, to get them to divest from, for instance, municipalities who rely on criminal fees and fines to service debt, right? So trying to think about, to push bondholders in part to push a generational cohort. There's a little bit of a generational argument here. Younger investors, impact investors, those who have perhaps inherited a great deal of capital and who are looking to invest along equitable lines, looking to, for instance, invest in projects that give us on this planet a fighting chance in the face of climate change. So Activist is another group that's pursuing the matter from questions of infrastructure and social services through the angle from the vantage of bondholder engagement.
Thank you so much.
And I will say though, sorry, Nia, and what the two share in common, I think, is a commitment or perhaps coming to peace with or terms with the structural relationship and dependence of municipalities on the bond market, right? That is left unquestioned, or if it's questioned, it is nevertheless taken as something one has to live with, abide by, come to terms with in order to deliver critical resources along equitable lines right now.
Thank you, Destin.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Destin. I think we're at time now. So please, let's give Destin a virtual round of applause here, snaps for all the knowledge and insight you just shared. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, real pleasure. Thank you all for the work that you do. Just grateful y'all would spend this Wednesday evening with me. And I wish you all the very best, and look forward to keeping tabs and checking out what you guys are up to.
Destin, could you share any socials so folks can find you after, or where can people?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. What is my Twitter? I think I'm Destin K. Jenkins. I think that's right. Yeah, let's see. Sorry. Let's see. I think that's me on Twitter. You guys could see me there.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to stop the recording now.